Hello guys, welcome back. Episode number 2 of this series where we are developing a real-world Angular application step by step. I hope you've already watched the previous episode. If that's not the case, please make sure you do that. In this episode, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of data binding and component communication. So these are the goals for this episode. We are going to understand property binding, event binding, two-way binding. We are going to create a new component for adding a new employee. We are going to talk about emitting events from a child component to a parent component. And I'm going to introduce you to component communication and Angular forms. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about the different types of data binding that exist in Angular. So by data binding, I mean having some data that you want to bind to, that you want to connect to. That data could be, for example, inside of your TypeScript file, and you want to bind to that data from your template file. For example, take a look at our application so far. So you remember from episode number 1 that we had this data, for example, this array is a piece of data, right? So an array with multiple employees. And we bound to this array inside of our TypeScript file from our template file. So if I go to employee list component, we are doing some binding here. So we are connecting to the data that exists in the TypeScript file. But that's not the only way to do the binding. You see, we are doing interpolation here. This is for displaying data. This is one type of data binding. But there are other types of data binding that you can learn and you can use, and I'm going to show you that in this episode. So different types of data binding. The first one, which we are using right now, is called interpolation. And it is used for displaying data. You've got some data, for example, inside of your TypeScript file. You want to show it in your template file. You use this type of binding. Property binding. You use property binding when you want to set a DOM property on an element. So for example, you want to set the src property of an image to some value. This is the syntax. You need to surround that src attribute using a square brackets. Event binding. This is the next one. When you want to listen for events, for example, you have like a button that you want to bind to some function. The function is declared in your TypeScript file. When that button is clicked, you want to invoke that function. So you want to, for example, bind the click event of that button to that function that you have in your TypeScript file. Two-way binding. So two-way binding, which is something that we are going to talk about, is used when you want to synchronize, right, the value inside of your component in your TypeScript file and the value that exists in the template file. So whenever the user, for example, enters something in an input box, you want that value to go directly to some property inside of your TypeScript file. So this is called two-way data binding. It is achieved using ngModel that I am going to talk about in this episode. For us to be able to talk about these different data bindings, the first step is to create a component. We're going to create employee form as a standalone component, and then we are going to write the code for employee form. It is not that difficult. So the one important thing is this output that I am going to talk about, right? And I am using this, output employee created here inside of add employee. This is something that I would like to discuss in detail with you. But yeah, let's first, create this employee form component and then come back to the notes and talk about the output and see what the output is doing. So inside of my application, right, what I am going to do is to create the component first. The component is called employee form. After the employee form is created, this is the employee form, right? We want to write the TypeScript file, the TypeScript code. Currently, it does nothing, right? So I'm going to remove this and I'm going to write the code for the file. I am using event emitter and output. These are two very important things that I would like to discuss. I'm importing the employee type. I'm importing forms module. And then this is going to be a standalone component. and I am going to export the component. We are going to have a new employee, and then we are going to have an output employee created, and inside of the add employee we want to emit that employee created output, and we want to create we want to actually reset this new employee to an empty employee before adding that new employee to our collection. Now let's talk about the event emitter and the output before we update the code for the template of this component. So we created this output, right? Output event emitter employee. Let's talk about this. This line does two things. Marks the employee created as an output property. What does an output property mean? Using output means this property is meant to send data from this child component to its parent. So this employee form is going to be used inside of employee list. So for employee form, there is a parent called employee list. Using this output property, which is called employee created, we will be able to send some data from the child component employee form to the parent component employee list. So the parent component can listen for this event using Angular syntax, like for example this. So employee form, right? This is the form we just created. This is the property, the output property, employee created, and this is the function that is going to handle this event. So whenever we bind this output property to this event, it means that to this function, it means that there is a function inside of the parent component that is going to be responsible for handling this event emitter. So this creates a new event emitter employee. This event emitter is a tool to actually emit events and send data. In this case, the data that we are sending is an employee. So using this event emitter from our child component, we are sending a full employee, right, to the parent component, which is the employee list, and that parent component is going to get that employee and do something with it. For example, it's going to show it inside of the list. If you take a look right now, inside of our employee list, what we are doing is we are showing a list of employees. So the basic idea is that using employee form, we are going to send a full employee to the parent, which is employee list, and this is going to take that employee and render it here. So let's continue with this. This employee created emit, we're going to call emit, and we're going to add this new employee. If you take a look at the employee form, inside of add employee, we are going to use that event emitter, employee created, right? And we are going to call emit on it, and we are going to destructure the new employee, right? The new employee is here. We're going to destructure this, right? And we're going to send it to our parent component. And I'm going to show you the template file as well. The template file is going to be able to put some values for this new employee. So here, this line is used to emit or send the new employee data to the parent component, which is the employee list component in this case. This employee created emit triggers the employee created event, and this new employee uses the spread operator to create a copy of the new employee object. This avoids accidental mutations of the original object. So we're sending a copy of the employee object or new employee object. Now let's write the employee form HTML file or template. Take a look at the code. We've got a form, right? We've got a form. The ng submit of the form, this is an event we are handling, is going to be handled using the add employee function. So this function is going to be able to handle the form submission. Whenever the form is submitted, this function is going to start handling that, form submission. And inside of the labels and inputs, we are using two-way data binding using ngModel, which is something that I am going to discuss with you down the road. Now, let me go to the component file, the HTML file, and let me write the code for this component. This component is going to help us create a new employee. We're going to have different inputs for role, for name, and a button to submit the form. And whenever the form is submitted, there's going to be an event handler or a function inside of the TS file of this component that is going to handle the form submission. How is it going to handle the form submission? It's going to take the name and it's going to take the role, right? Let's take a look. If they have some values, it's going to, emit that whole employee to its parent component. And because we are using two-way data binding, these are bound to new employee.name and new employee.role. If you take a look here, this is the new employee, right? So the new employee name and role at first are empty, but I'm using two-way data binding to get the value inside of the input fields and set them to these two properties of the new employee. The ID is going to be auto-generated. The projects array is going to be empty for new employees. And then if there is some value for role as well as the name, we're going to emit that new employee that has the name and role set using the values inside of the input fields on the form using two-way data binding. And then we are resetting that new employee. Now let's talk about ngModel. So ngModel is used for two-way data binding. It is the two-way data binding directive in Angular provided by Forms module. And I think you remember we imported the Forms module. I'm going to show you again. So it allows data to flow both ways from the component class, like the code inside of your TS file, to the HTML view, to your template, and from the HTML view or template, like the text that the user puts inside of the input boxes, back to the component class. And this is the Forms module. I told you we are importing the Forms module. So in this example, we are using the ngModel on, for example, the input, which is going to bind itself to the name of that new employee. So the input displays the current value of new employee.name. At the same time, when the user types a new value inside of the input, that new value is going to be set to new employee.name automatically. And that value is going to be updated inside of the component. So the name equals name is required by Angular Forms module for two-way data binding to work in the form. This is required when you are using forms. Two-way data binding visualization. Take a look at this. If new employee.name is Alice, for example, the input box will display Alice when the component loads. But if the user changes this to something else like Bob, without doing anything else, the new employee.name, which was previously Alice, is going to change to Bob instantly because you are using two-way data binding. Now, to use ngModel, you must import Forms module inside of your component or your module. We're using standalone components, so we are importing Forms module, and then add a name attribute to the input element when used inside of a form. Right now, we're using it inside of a form, and we are using the name attribute for these inputs. We're setting these to name and role for the employee. The next step is to update the employee list component and make use of that employee form component. So right now, if you check out the employee list, let me close out this. We are creating an array, right? An array of employees with some hard-coded values, and we are showing the elements inside of that array using this directive and this pipe. This is something that we achieved in episode 1. Now I want to change this and I want to use that employee form. So basically, this employee list component will be the parent of this employee form component. So the user, whenever we render employee list component, will not only see the list of employees, but there will be a form here to allow the user to enter the values for a new employee. So let me get rid of this, and I am going to write the code for the new version of employee list. Let's import employee type. I'm importing common module as before. I'm importing the new component as well, employee form component. It's going to be app list component, the selector. It's going to be a standalone. Common module needs to be imported. The employee form component needs to be imported. We are creating that array one more time with some hard-coded values that we are going to refactor in upcoming videos. We're going to create a service, for example, in the next episode. And finally, we will fetch these from our backend API. And then the next employee, the project's array is empty. And now the next ID is going to be 3. And this is the function that will be handling the event emitted by the child component. Now the next step is to update the employee list HTML template. So what we need to do is to allow the user to enter the information for a new employee and also render the employees that we have inside of that array using directives like ng4. This is something that we also did in the previous episode. So take a look here. We are using employee form component. You remember inside of employee form, I showed you this event emitter. So we kind of saw that when the form is submitted, it is going to be handled using add employee. So the form is going to be, take a look. When submitted, it's going to be handled using add employee. Add employee is defined here. When add employee is invoked, it's going to take this whole employee object and is going to emit it to its parent component. The parent component in this case is employee list. If you take a look at employee list here, it is using the employee form, and for this output property called employee created, it says whenever you want to handle this employee created output property, use this function that is already declared here. So it's kind of doing some binding, right, between the output property of that employee form and the function created inside of the employee list. So let's take a look at this. This is going to take in the whole employee sent by the event emitter from the child component, and it's going to set the ID of that employee, because from the child component the ID is going to be empty. The project's array is going to be empty as well. It's going to set the ID using this next ID, and it's going to push it to that employee's array here. So let me refresh the application. Let me see if I have anything to discuss here. We already implemented this, and this is the summary of this episode. Let me restart the application. So I'm gonna run ngserve one more time and see the application again. Yes, this is the employee form component, and this is the employee list. So, I mean, to be precise, this is the whole employee list component. This is the output we get when we invoke the employee form, and this is the template that we defined ourselves for employee list. So whenever inside of the employee form component, whenever I enter my name, for example, and if I, enter my role. So using two-way data binding, this name and this role are now inside of the new employee here, inside of this new employee, because we are using two-way data binding. Do you remember using ngModel? Now, when I submit this, the submission of the form is going to be handled using this function, and this function is going to, emit the event, the output property, employee created, to its parent component. The parent component is the employee list, and that employee list is going to do what? That employee list here is going to take that employee, is going to add it to this array, and that array is going to be shown here because the component is looping through the employees array and rendering the employees. This is what is happening here, right? So let's wrap up this video by studying the summary. So in this episode, we used two-way data binding using ngModel. Using forms, we created and submitted a form. We used event binding to pass data from the child component to a parent component using event emitter and an output property. We enhanced the modularity with a new component called employee form, and we kind of had a communication between the child component and the parent component using output and event emitter. But that's not the end of it. In the next episode, I want to create a service. Right now, the data that we have inside of the application is hard-coded inside of the employee list. This is going to be refactored. This is not the best way to do this. We will create a service class, and that service class will be responsible for providing the data to the components and handling adding new employees. And that's the topic for the next episode. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. And if that's the case, as always, try to share it with a friend, give it a thumbs up, and stay tuned for the next episode.